Moshe Taragin here for the OU ALLPARSHA series. I'm obviously traveling, so I'm not at home. I'm in an office, and I don't have my microphone. So hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully it's clear enough. This year, Parshas Acharei and Kedoshim are read together, as they are most years. Not all, but this year they're read together. So I want to speak about interesting halacha, pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. Kedoshim is very saturated with halachos. The beginning, of course, shifts from what we think the parsha is meant to be and what Rashi assumes the parsha is, Kedoshim tiyu ki kadoshim Hashem Elokechem, which is to be disengaged from this world, either parish min harayos, or in general, as the Ramban says, to be a little bit detached from this world. Remember, kadosh doesn't mean holy. Kadosh means detached. Hashem is the ultimate different because he's not physical. He's not part of the system. He obviously shares nothing in common with the system. We're meant to be a little bit different and detached from the system. We're physical. We're part of nature, Reshis Parak Aleph, but by avoiding food, not eating everything we want, whenever we want, by avoiding Isur Arayos in other areas, we're meant to be a little bit kadosh, like Hashem is Kedoshim tiyu ki kadoshim Hashem Elokechem. But then the psukim switch really quickly into Ben Adam L'Chavero, about not lying, not cheating, not holding back schar, not exploiting the vulnerable, the deaf, the blind, and of course the pinnacle of Ben Adam L'Chavero, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, as Rabbi Akiva said, Ze klal gadol b'Torah, without getting into that interesting word klal. He didn't call it mitzvah gadola, he called it a klal gadol. But the ensuing pasuk speaks about a mitzvah which we tend to ho-hum. Not ho-hum chas v'shalom, the level of halacha gravitas, but in terms of its symbolism and its metaphor, mitzvah of Arla. But there's a lot of deep meaning to Arla, and I want to try to elucidate four levels of meaning. So this normally I try to hone in on one topic, but Arla is too juicy. Hope you got the pun. Arla is too juicy. It really isn't juicy because it's the first couple of years of a fruit, but at least halachically, conceptually, it's a very juicy topic. The chisavau, I'll just read out of my computer. I don't have the pasuk. I want to the pasuk right. The chisavau, it's not right after the Chakamacha, but it's pasuk of Gimel, a few seconds later. Chisavau la'aretz and tatem koleitz machal v'aral temar l'sas priyosha l'shanim. For 3 years, you can't eat the first 3 year fruits. And the Arla is knowing also in Chutz La'aretz is Alecha Moshe Sinai, so it's one of the mitzvos of agriculture that stretches to Chutz La'aretz as well. Although again, in most cases, we're not farmers, and Jewish people aren't really, and again, most of the cases, the first 3 years of crops really aren't that edible, which is part of the reason that they want us to eat it. Anyway, getting back to some of the symbolisms, the Medrash says that just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu created his world, and the first thing he did, at least from a human perspective, was after he created man, Hashem planted trees in Gan Eden. Similarly, just like Hashem began his world by planting, similarly we should. And therefore, when we enter Eretz Yisrael, which is, as I'll speak on it in a moment, our beginning, we should also plant trees. So that doesn't mean the first thing halachically you should do when you get to Eretz Yisrael is plant a tree, although it's a nice idea. Talk about this a little bit later, but and especially in the light of what we've just experienced this past week, 2025, Tashin Pehei. But the first element of this medrash is stressing the importance and the nobility of work ethic, of working and toiling. So the planting isn't planting trees per se, but working and investing and patience. And planting trees is toil. It's digging, it's planting, it's tending to it, it's cultivating. And for a Jew, work ethic is, on many levels, it's ennobling. Right? You could be an atheist and find working hard and fulfilling tasks ennobling. Some of the early secular Zionists who weren't believers in Hashem saw working the land as a redeeming quality. Some of you may have read or heard of A.B. Gordon and some others. So the fact that we want to work hard is not just because we believe that human nature is enhanced and ennobled because we're trying to imitate Hashem. Because Hashem doesn't work. Who Amar Vayehi, that he just speaks, and of course his speech isn't even human speech, but at least to us it appears as if he's worked hard to craft this world, and we want to be like Hashem. And one of the ways that we are like Hashem, we typically think of Mahu Rachum, Afata Rachum, Mahu Chanun, Afata Chanun, Mahu from a moral standpoint. For a Jew, morality isn't driven by social codes or by social contracts or even by a moral instinct. It's driven by the desire to be most like Hashem, to be compassionate like the Ribono Shel Olam. But one of the ways we imitate Hashem is to, first of all, be creative, and planting a tree is a creative act because you're taking a seed and creating something larger, something productive, but also to work. Like, at least to us, it appears that HaKadosh Baruch Hu works. And one of the traits that I admired most in Rav Lichtenstein, it was just his yahrzeit last week. I don't know when you're listening to this, but it was his yahrzeit the week of Tizria Mitzvah, Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the second day. And what I saw in Rav Lichtenstein was his desire to perfect every single component of human identity. If we were to compile the list of the classic, so to speak, religious traits that we read about in Sifrei Musar, so we think about humility, prayer, holiness, precious, avoiding inclination, discipline, Talmud Torah, midos, b'rem l'chavero. But if we were to expand the list, let's say we were to make a list of 100 traits that you would expect to be found in the best human being, you can create a much larger list. And I felt that Rav Lichtenstein worked very hard at all those traits: work ethic, loyalty, discipline, so many areas of human traits, because the best human being you are, the better human being you are, the better Oved Hashem you are. And one of the things he didn't just speak about often, and he quoted this medrash in Parshas Kedoshim, but he exemplified, I never saw anyone work harder, manage his time, work carefully. There are legends about how little he slept. Not to say that the sleep deprivation is an index of productivity or of piety, but for him, we definitely got the sense that he was working very hard at his avodas Hashem, largely applied, not just chesed, not that it's just, but not just mitzvos, but perfecting human conduct, human character. The second issue that should be taken from this pasuk, it's a very, very layered pasuk. Second issue is that the first mitzvah, at least in Parshas Kedoshim, that is described as we enter the land. There are other psukim, obviously, b'chisavo la'aretz unetatem kol eitz ma'achal. So without getting into the details, what about the other mitzvahs that are described? B'chisavo la'aretz, challah being the most famous one, Parshas Shlach, maybe we'll talk about when Parshas Shlach comes. What's the function of challah in Parshas Shlach? But at least in Parshas Kedoshim, in April and May, the first mitzvah is planting the land. Now if you invert that, it's not just a mitzvah, but it's also an indicator. Right? We're all looking for simanim, for omens, that this is real, that our return to Eretz Yisrael is Yad Hashem. And I'm intentionally not using ideologically charged words. Some people will call it Reishis Michas Gedulasenu. Other people will call it Ikfus de Mashiach. Some people are uncomfortable with any type of label, but I think that most of Am Yisrael knows that something's happening historically. However you call it, and how quickly you expect it to happen, and whether you assign divine essence to Jewish sovereignty and sanctity to the state of it, those are all questions that people feel differently. Obviously, probably can assume what I believe, and being that this is an OU video, what the OU as an institution believes, but I wasn't asked to plug the OU. I think one of the nice parts of the OU, at least in America, is that I think its reach stretches to individuals who may not sign up for every single ideological clause in the OU mission, but are interested in the type of Torah that OU produces. So however you call it, something's happening in history, and one of the indicators that something is happening in Jewish history is the fact that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, has been transformed from a barren, desiccated, wild, untamed wilderness that all the leading empires throughout history tried to tame and tried to cultivate and tried to till and failed, and the blooming of our country. And it's just the contrast between Israel and all the countries surrounding it, and the contrast in water, which I think we don't have to be embarrassed to say, because I always feel uncomfortable when we daven Tal or Geshem, because 20, 30 years ago, I'm not that young, but 20, 30 years ago, I remember shaking and trembling when we daven Geshem, because we really needed the water to make it to the next year in Eretz Yisrael. And now some of that tension and drama has been alleviated because of desalination and water management. Again, nothing is certain, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu created all types of circumstances which remind us of acute human dependency. But I think when we daven Geshem, we daven Hashem to continue to give us the technology to provide sweet drinking water, which in the Middle East is a strategic asset, as evidenced by what's happening and should happen to some of our enemies like Iran, not to the people, but to the regime, because they're suffering water shortages. So one of the signs that this return is real, and sadly enough, and ironically enough, on Yom HaTzmaut this year in Israel, again, Yom HaTzmaut this year in Israel wasn't really Hey ER, so look at your calendar, and no one believes that there's sanctity to Hey ER. It's a moment that modern Jews celebrate the Nisim, those who see it as Nisim that we were privileged to, and those who feel that celebrating it on the day that the government that's representative of Am Yisrael chose. Those who don't feel the government is representative won't keep that day, but a lot of people say, well, it wasn't really Hey ER. Okay, it's not Hey ER, but the day that Jews assembled, Hakel Asa'am, to celebrate the Nisim that have been marked by our ability to tame this land's fertility and to produce a beautiful, green, productive, agriculturally advanced country. The country was beset by wildfires and raging fires, and again, all the Yom HaTzmaut ceremonies were disrupted. Not the first time. Hopefully the last time. We had it during Corona, we had it during the wartime last year, but it just reminds us that this is still an ongoing struggle, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the first symbolism of this pasuk is work ethic. The second symbolism is fertility. When you come into Eretz Yisrael, you'll plant trees and the land will respond to you. I think Gemara in Ksubas, in the end of the Maseches Ksubas, talks about the supernatural bounty of Eretz Yisrael, something we haven't yet seen, but if you look at it globally over the last 2,000 years, it does feel supernatural, given the inability of other cultures and countries to till this land. The third issue, maybe I'll only talk about 3 issues. I see the show is getting a little longer than I wanted. The third issue is as follows. 3.5. The word arla, which is the way the Torah describes the Isser to eat the first 3 years of fruit, conjures up in our minds the other arel that's described in the Torah. That's the arla of Mila. And the word arel, of course, means covered. And Rashi in Parshas Kedoshim, this isn't a Rashi shir, but it's an interesting Rashi. How do you get to the Isser from the word arla? It's a strange word to use, because unlike the male member, which is actually covered by a foreskin, the word arel literally means covered. The fruits that grow during the first 3 years aren't covered by anything. They're just fruits that are unripened. So why does the Torah, etymologically, grammatically, how do we transform the word arla into usser? That's Rashi, Parshas Kedoshim. I think I've spoken about it in the past on some of the Rashi Sherman Torah. But the larger metaphor is that just like the human body is imperfect until Mila occurs, there's a famous debate between Rabbi Akiva and Tunis Rufus, the Roman philosopher general, who agitated against Judaism, or also explored Judaism while he's agitating. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants a human being to have a bris milah, if that's the ideal form of the human body, the Romans viewed milah as mutilation, so this was a really current, contemporary issue. Why does then HaKadosh Baruch Hu create people already, as we say in Yiddish, gemalt, already circumcised? And Akiva's answer effectively was Hashem intentionally leaves his world imperfect so that we can create it. And so Milah is transforming Hashem's intentionally imperfect world, in this case the human body, into a more perfect state, which is why when HaKadosh Baruch Hu introduces Milah, he tells Avram, Hishalech lefanai v'yei tamim. The pasuk should be inverted. Hayei tamim, through Milah, kadesh tishalech lefanai. You can't be in front of Hashem unless you have a Milah. The 3 mitzvahs you can't perform if you don't have a milah, even for good reasons. Like say you're in a family which is medically dangerous, proven to be medically dangerous, you can't have a milah, you can perform every mitzvah. It's no fault of your own except for eating truma, eating korban pesach, and walking into the Beis HaMikdash. You can't be lifnei Hashem. So hayei tamim, become perfect by milah, lehisalech lefanai. Why the pasuk is inverted is its own parshas lech lecha question. But so if milah perfects the human body, then arla perfects nature, in the case of the tree, but nature in general. So there's a parallelism between the Isser of arla and the mitzvah of milah. They each lead to perfection. One is in the human body, one is in nature, and each represent HaKadosh Baruch Hu intentionally leaving nature, human bodies, or the natural system, agriculture, imperfect, so that we can perfect it. We can lend that. And Motzi Lechem Min Haaretz, Hashem doesn't produce challah, he produces wheat, we then transform it to challah. There's a difference between the perfection of milah and the perfection of arla. Mila is an attempt to achieve, or achieving perfection through human activity in a proactive way. Arla, you can't do anything to accelerate time, you just have to wait. And second of all, Mila is in an instant, in a flash, whereas Arla takes time. And beyond the fourth element, so there really are four elements, but beyond getting to Eretz Yisrael, sometimes in life we have to realize that improvement is a function of time, and there's very little we can do about it. So self-improvement sometimes doesn't conform to that. We can take active steps, but sometimes in our relationships, sometimes in other areas of our life, time has to heal wounds, time has to heal relationships, time has to grant us experience, grant us wisdom. And I'm not so sure that we're accustomed to letting things play out over time and letting time take its course and being passive rather than active. We feel very empowered to make change rather than realizing sometimes we can, and sometimes the activity we take can only stall or reverse progress. So the third level of Arla is that sometimes perfection is like Mila, proactive and immediate, and sometimes perfection is gradual, time, and there's really nothing you can do to intervene. And the fourth layer of metaphor to this mitzvah is, of course, taking the third layer and applying it to our current state, that coming into Eretz Yisrael and settling the land, Kitav Ol Eretz. Why is that the first mitzvah, at least in Parshas Kedoshim, the first mitzvah described coming to Eretz Yisrael? Because this is a mitzvah that reminds us that we will need patience to settle the land of Hashem, just like we need patience to wait for the 3 years. Because this isn't, I'm sitting in Teaneck now, this isn't Teaneck, this isn't, I don't know, wherever you may be, Boston, Baltimore, Washington, Los Angeles, just to move from the East Coast, Cleveland, a little bit Midwest. You know, the OU is very active across the country, so I don't want to leave any region untouched. But this is Eretz Yisrael. This is the land of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is the land of Eretz Acharei Yoshveha, and it's beyond human reach. And when human beings attempt to settle it, some people say, well, therefore the entire attempt to settle it isn't divinely encouraged or coveted. We should just wait for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to hand it to us. Obviously, I don't believe that. I'm a settler in more ways than one. I live in Gush Etzion for that reason. I believe that part of my avodas Hashem in history is living in Gush Etzion or anywhere else in the country, but that's my choice where to live, in Eretz Yisrael. And it was never quick and easy. And sometimes we've waited so long and our appetites are so incited and whetted, W-H-E-T-T-E-T, we're so anticipatory that we expect it to happen quickly, and when it doesn't, we get frustrated. It didn't happen that way when we entered Eretz Yisrael the first time. It took us 14 years to conquer it and to distribute it. Yud Dalet of Kibush and Chalukah, and really didn't even end after 14 years if you follow your Tanakh. It took hundreds of years to fully settle Eretz Yisrael, including Yerushalayim. So it was in the Bi'ashniya, and the return of Ezra. It took 5 or 6 waves to fully settle the land and even to build the Beis HaMikdash. And it's taking that same stage and gradual Kima approach now. And of course, it's not just slow, but it's also, there are reversals and traumas and tragedies. But keep in mind that this is the land of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the simplistic notion that we'll just pitch our tents and within a couple of years establish our presence there without international opposition, without struggle. We hope that it's true, and Hashem promises us there are prophecies and nevuos that do portray it that way, but there are just the same, there are expectations sometimes that we have to wait for. I will just end with, just close with the well-known nevuah of Amos, and Amos Perek Tes, and many people today in Eretz Yisrael, if you walk around, especially in the settlements, they put this on their door or they'll engrave it on the stone, in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises us, V'natati alat masam, v'natatim alat masam, v'lo yinachu od me'alat masam. I will plant you on your land, you will never be removed from your land. Asher nasati lahem, the land that I promise you. Amar, Hashem Elokayach, Hashem, Amos is speaking, Hashem, your God says. So when we read Parshas Kedoshim, maybe it's a good time to think about this pasuk in Amos and how hard we're trying to plant ourselves on this land. There's a larger metaphor. We ask Hashem to plant us, and this is, of course, the lashon of Musaf, Tikanta Shabbat Tzisa Kopanoser, Tzisa Perashim Zunecha. We ask Kedosh Baruch Hu V'Sitoinu Big Vulenu, that Hashem should plant us in Eretz Yisrael. So during a week in which we realize how hard it is to plant ourselves in Israel, and literally all the trees that we planted, not all, but a lot of the forests that we planted so tenderly and caringly and devotedly burned down, we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to plant us in Eretz Yisrael. And we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't wait for 3 years. Let it happen quickly. We're chayiv in Arla. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we don't want to wait. We want to be planted as quickly as possible. Shabbat Shalom.